Kate Falter, welcome to Irish Granny Helen, and this is our Saturday book. We are on video number 8 of The Real Marilyn Monroe by Larry Jordan. A wonderful book, and this is video number 8. I'm going to run out of fingers here pretty quickly. Okay. And this is chapter 22. The name of which is I Like My Freedom. She was very alone on her 35th birthday in 1961. She said, it's wonderful being a girl. She's talking about aging, but it's more wonderful being a woman. Somebody asked her, how do you feel? She changed her hair. She changed her clothes. She had a very unique fashion sense. It was right on. She set a lot of fashion trends. For example, and this is still, I believe, kind of popular look today. What do I know? One of those colored men's style white shirts and jeans. I guess that was not common until Marilyn Monroe made it common. She had an effortless style that transcended the test of time. She began spending time with Frank Sinatra, and it made her doctor, Dr. Greenson, jealous. Okay, what's wrong with that sentence? He wrote to a colleague complaining and said that it did not prevent her from canceling several hours with him to go to Palm Springs with Frank Sinatra. She is unfaithful to me as one is to a parent. So he was acting as if Sinatra were a rival for her affections. Sinatra and the brothers didn't allow photos to be taken with them and her. They were all paranoid about that. And Sinatra confiscated a camera and threatened violence to a photographer who tried to photograph them together. It's not hard to... If you have not seen Phil Hartman doing Frank Sinatra on Saturday Night Live, I strongly recommend it. At his Vegas show, Sinatra's Vegas show, she went and she sat at the same table as Elizabeth Taylor, who later said Marilyn Monroe could not hold her liquor. If you watch Virginia Woolf, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, she couldn't keep it up. The drinking habits of the Rat Pack, you know, that group of weirdos that hung out together in Vegas with Frank Sinatra, and they drank like fish, and she couldn't keep up with it. Whitey, her friend, said that since her divorce, and she's in the best condition she's been in a very long time. She's happy, and I'm amazed at how well she is. And then, you know, she went to Gable's son's baptism, and she returned to New York to work on pre-production meetings with NBC about Rain, and this was a project that they were planning, but they had conflicts, and it just got abandoned. There's a lot. It seems like there's a lot of that in the movie and TV business. Projects that sort of go nowhere and be very frustrating. Work for years on something and then nothing. The Strasbergs were always taking money from her and asking for more. For example, Paula called her from Paris to ask for money for the flight home. Marilyn commented to a journalist that reams of stories about her show up in the media, and she said, I don't know where they get the information because it's not correct. She says, I like my freedom. I'm very proud of my stepchildren. She was very close to Joe's son and Arthur Miller's, or is it the other way around? Can't keep all husbands and children straight. Earl Wilson, a journalist, gave him an interview, and he said he referred to her as the most famous blonde in captivity. She started looking for a small house in LA and in New York. She wasn't interested in a husband, but she wanted a home. she said, and this is all talked about in this interview with him, she's acting, she said, is now my main interest. She had her gallbladder removed and apparently was a prolific reader while in the hospital. She paid for a hairdresser to fly from Los Angeles to New York to do her hair so she could leave the hospital looking good because all the photographers were outside. So there's a story here about water being spilled on her before a press conference, and I'd forgotten about this. The water made her dress see-through, and she notoriously did not wear underwear, and her friend, the hairdresser, sent her into the bathroom with peroxide, and apparently this is true, made her bleach her pubic hair before she went out in public so nobody could see because this dress was so see-through. I don't know. Is that true? They're all claiming it's true. Anyway, there was a huge crowd outside the hospital, so she had her hairdresser come and make her beautiful. And she got pushed around so badly by the mob hanging out that her incision opened. And you can actually see on her clothing where there's a little bleeding on her belly because, which is just horrifying. She said, I wasn't sure that I was going to get into that car safely and get away. Her sister Bernice came to help her and described tactics that they took for over 10 years to avoid the press. Joe DiMaggio was opposed to Bernice coming. There's a big surprise again. Didn't want her at the beach in Florida either. Didn't want her to come to LA to help out after surgery. He's a control freak. Marilyn was only allowed out of bed a couple of hours a day because she needed to heal her stomach muscles. A gift arrived at the house of somebody sent her dinner, a big gigantic Italian dinner, but she threw it out and she told her sister and who else was there, I can't be sure it's safe to eat what they've put into it. I can't eat something that someone sends to the house. It could be poisoned. Bernice was appalled by the number of pills that had been prescribed to Marilyn. A doctor came by every day, and Bernice asked, how long will she be on those pills? And Marilyn got kind of defensive about it and said, well, I need those pills. Bernice worried. Joe came over every night after dinner, and Marilyn actually confessed that she missed Joe Jr., his son, more than she missed Joe. Bernice saw Joe find a receipt in the trash for something, and he looked at it, and it was twice what it should have been. They doubled, like a grocery store receipt being delivered. And they discovered that she was being ripped off all the time by people. People were overcharging her and lying about what they had done, and charging too much for what they did do, and then lying about what they had done. She'd left her bills to her secretary, and she did go over the books, and she said, I seem to be paying more for things, and I'm paying for things that I don't remember ever buying. She was too trusting. She was regularly bilked. She had no sense of going comparison shopping. She overpaid for a lot of stuff. People charged her 3 times the real price because, she's Marilyn Monroe. She paid all of her help way too well, it was said. She was also hounded by charities, and she had to pay to avoid bad press. If she didn't donate to charities, she looked bad and people talked about it. They think I'm rich. Everyone is begging for money, she said. It was obvious to Bernice that the Strasbergs were a problem. Marilyn had conflicted opinions about them. She sensed that it was not a good situation. She wanted to buy a house in New York City, but Joe talked her out of it. She said, I just want a place I can call my own home. I want to decorate because decorating chases my worries away. She got a little Maltese pup as a gift from Frank Sinatra. And she called the dog Maff as in mafia. Moff, I guess, as in mafia. She made a trip by car with Ralph and Bernice to the Connecticut house again to pick up the rest of her stuff. And when she was leaving, she made a point of quietly saying goodbye to a bush that she'd planted in the yard. Bernice went home to Los Angeles. Marilyn went to use Sinatra's house. He was out of town. For the privacy, she wanted to avoid the crowds around her own house, and she told Bernice, "Don't tell Joe." She was on a tightrope with Joe, being a friend, but avoiding his hostility and his controlling. Before she left to go to Sinatra's house, she did a voiceover for the USO. She was always donating her time to things like that. Chapter 23, brimming with optimism. She went to Sinatra's to recuperate, and Ralph came and was her driver because she wasn't supposed to drive. And she wasn't allowed to bring her dog on the plane. So she went to Los Angeles and the Beverly Hills Hotel first, and his limo picked her up at the airport. Sinatra's limo picked her up at the airport. His house was by William Pereira, and it was made by the same guy who made the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco. He made the Disney Hotel in Anaheim, the LA County Museum of Art, and LAX, the airport. And I wanted to show you this house because I personally would never want to live in a house like this. But I'm not Marilyn Monroe, in case you didn't know. Okay, look at this house. It looks like a whole bunch of glass boxes. If you can see that. I just think it's the coldest, least inviting place I've ever seen. There's nothing cozy about it. He rented in the 50s and 60s, 7 bedrooms and 9 bathrooms. It has floor-to-ceiling windows, and the whole thing is like a long glass box. It's 8,000 square feet. That's a lot of Windex. Marilyn stayed in the guest house. She didn't stay in the main house. It just down the road from, it's on 1,300 acres, and it's just down the road from this huge nature preserve. It had a fancy bar. It had a huge library. And it just goes on and on, all these amenities. So she had a custom-made black wig, and the question is asked here, why did she go around so disguised? I think it's self-evident. This house had its own theater, by the way. So she watched movies and she watched Bus Stop. She thought it was her best movie. She was in good spirits and in good shape and on a very disciplined diet. She thought that Ralph should bottle or market his salad dressing. And this was novel thinking for the day. This is long before the Paul Newman ideas. If she had bottled that salad dressing with her name on it, it would have been gold mine. She was on this very strict diet, but she drank a split of champagne every day. A split is, I think, like 2 glasses, half a bottle. Maybe a little more than that, but not a whole lot. She went shopping for her own place, but she ended up renting an apartment in the same building next door to the apartment she'd lived in with Joe. Ralph found a place nearby and sublet it from Estelle Winwood. She was the oldest actor in the United States at 96 and the oldest member of the Screen Actors Guild at 101. Marilyn recalled Liz Taylor used to have the penthouse of that same apartment building when she was married to Nicky Hilton, so it couldn't have been too bad. Ralph told how she turned Marilyn off and on. She was walking for, so she was walking to a hardware store, and she was in a disguise, right? And he said he was behind her, and she suddenly, just for fun, turned on the Marilyn walk. You know, that she had this walk, and he said the cars were screeching. He said it was like watching improv. She had therapy several times a week and shared details with Ralph, but he would never talk about it. He really truly cared about her. He didn't divulge her secrets the way a lot of other people did. To thank Frank Sinatra for letting her stay, he had just had a pond put in, and she bought these really rare koi to put in the pond. So there are rumors, you know, that she was drug-addled and booze-soaked, but this is not true at all. She was working on her fitness. She was in excellent shape. She was running on the beach every day. She used to jog the back alleys of Beverly Hills before breakfast, and she'd say, "You'd be surprised what you can learn about famous people by what they throw away." She ran on the beach often because she said running on the beach for her was like a spiritual experience. There are all these rumors about her. Now, yes, she was over-medicated by her doctors, but she wasn't a recreational drug addict. She wasn't even doing like an addiction to opioids that were first a prescription and then became an addiction. She was just not being treated properly and being over-medicated by her doctors intentionally to keep control of her. She and Ralph walked or ran for miles along the coast, and you have to be in pretty good shape to walk miles on the sand. She told Ralph that she was originally named for Norma Talmadge, the actress, which we're going to do something about later. Not today. Sinatra invited her to join him and Dean Martin and his wife on a yacht. But when she went, she said he was really stressful. He was moody and volatile. She also saw the doctor then. Sinatra claimed that she did too many pills and alcohol and then hounded him to marry her. This puts him in a really bad light, and it makes him sound like he's the one in control and she isn't. Did this really happen? And what the book has to say about that is Sinatra was verbally abusive to her. He treated her really badly. He was awful during this time, according to Kitty Kelly, the biographer. He yelled at Marilyn, saying, "Shut up, Norma Jean. You're so stupid you don't know what you're talking about." Phil Hartman, Saturday Night Live Sinatra. He was obnoxious and mean when he drank, and he threw a fit at the Lawfords and at Natalie Wood because they wouldn't stay up all night and party with him. Pat Lawford was visiting with her husband, and Natalie Wood was there at the yacht, and they wanted to go to bed. It was late, and he was mad. He wanted them to stay up. I mean, he was nasty. So there's a painting, a portrait of her on the stage by the Theater Guild. Not an actual picture, but an acting out portrait of her, like a little bit of This Is Your Life kind of thing, called The Venus at Large, that was done by the Theater Guild. And the actress playing Marilyn Monroe said that she was a better actress than anyone ever gave her credit for. Marilyn was. She was invited to a big party by Sinatra, who wanted all to see that she was not a dreadful old hag, and so she went. She heard the rumors about herself, and they were so incredibly untrue. She called Lena Pepitone, this is a woman on her staff in New York City, to fly to California with a special dress, and Pepitone wrote a book about her 18 years later, and it was very distorted. It was malicious. She claimed she had a close relationship with Marilyn, but Marilyn didn't really know her name. She said, "That woman that works at the house, can we get her to fly my dress? She's home in New York. Can she come and fly my dress?" And no record was ever found of her being steadily employed by Monroe, and it's easy to find records because she wrote checks to everybody. Haspiel, the fan, claimed that Pepitone was not even fluent in English. I don't know what kind of a snark thing to say. Marilyn was getting to know the Lawfords and going there often at the Malibu beach house. but she was broke. She's Marilyn Monroe, and she's broke. She had to take a $25,000 loan out from United Artists against the money that they owed her for some like not. She was often alone in the evening. She would call into a popular radio show, and she gave her name once, and they hung up on her. They didn't believe her. The DJ was invited to come and meet her, and he was shocked to find out that Marilyn Monroe had called his show and he'd hung up on her. Chapter 24, Marilyn visits the Kennedys at Cape Cod. So then she went with Sinatra to Hyannis in September of 61 and met the entire family. She flew to New York with Ralph and carried only one thing, a makeup box of personal letters. It looked like she had makeup with her. It was full of personal letters. The plane had to return to the plane station, to the airport, with problems. And as the plane emptied, this little event happened. Hang on. So they're on the plane. They're waiting for all the other passengers to get off. She's in disguise. And she says to Ralph, let's wait. Let's not get off right away. So he sat there in silence. She tipped her forefinger to her lips as each person filed by. She whispered, so long, dear people. This wasn't to be our destined appointment in Samara. May that be, far distant. This certainly doesn't sound like a depressed or suicidal person who doesn't value life and wishes for death. Incidentally, her reference to Samara was an allusion to a short story by John O'Hara, which exploited destiny, free will, and chance. The conclusion is that all events are predetermined and inevitable. Dumb, right? That she knew this stuff. She took out insurance while waiting for plane number 2, since plane number 1 had to return back with problems. She also sent a telegram to Joe about the delay, and it was dated and stamped, and it verifies the dates that she was going to be in New York and then in Hyannis. And she said, when we were worried about the plane not being able to make it back to the airport, I thought of 2 things, you and changing my will. Both thought of loved ones and good times when returning to Los Angeles to change planes. She realized that she was going to finish her last film with Fox and move on to bigger and better things. The scripts that they had given her were awful. Joe met them at the airport, but didn't go up to the apartment with her. He just dropped her off. And after she left him, she went to Hyannis. At the compound, Joe Sr. and the brothers were there. Joe Sr. gave his son, his older son, an interest-free mortgage on 6 acres of waterfront property to build a house and call it the Summer White House and Retreat. This whole compound became the emotional center of the family. On the evening of Saturday the 23rd, 2 cabbies were sent to meet a private plane, the Caroline, belonging to the family. And out came Sinatra from the plane with a drink in one hand and a tennis racket in the other, and then this woman in disguise, Marilyn. There were 26 dinner guests, and the next day they all went out on a big boat, and they made it very clear, they were very careful to make it clear that Sinatra was staying at Old Joe's, and Marilyn was with him and not at the brother's house. Jackie Kennedy was clearly jealous of Marilyn. She didn't return to New York when the husband did as planned. Who did? Peter Lawford and who else? This is the question that hangs in the air. We'll be doing a deeper dive on this if anyone's interested. Deborah and I on SUBSTACK behind the paywall, so keep your eyes open when we get done with the book. Why would Marilyn be invited to a family gathering? Was this an old family bad habit? They're referring to the fact that Joe Sr. had a relationship, an affair with Aunt Gloria. And she actually stayed with the family. This is so interesting. Gloria Swanson. This is one of the worst kept secrets. Swanson found it unbelievable that Rose Kennedy pretended to not know that the actress was sleeping with her husband. Swanson wondered, was she a fool? I asked myself with disbelief, or a saint, or just a better actress than I was. One day when their father took Gloria sailing in the family sailboat named after his wife Rose Elizabeth, young Jack, then 12, stowed away aboard the boat. When he spied on his father and the movie star, he was shocked to see them doing what you think they probably were doing. Traumatized by the experience, the future president dove into the water, whereupon his father jumped in after him and hauled him back on board. Well, the apple doesn't fall very far, apparently. Let's see, where are we here? Jackie tolerated him. He had no compunction about his wife and his girlfriend meeting. It wasn't a problem. It was common in the family. He slept with a 27-year-old member of Jackie's social circle and church congregation. Jackie invited her to numerous events. She was on a lot of guest lists from the White House. Jackie's press secretary, Pamela Turner, had a relationship with the brother, the older brother, 61 to 63. They would have quickies in the White House pool and then go back to Jackie's office. She would go back to Jackie's office. One of Joe's old mistresses and stewardess on the presidential plane gave him massages when Jackie wasn't around. Therapeutic, I'm sure. Deirdre Henderson, a research assistant, is said to have done more than research. Mary Pinchot Meyer, that's a really interesting story there. She was the sister-in-law of Ben Bradley of the Washington Post. She was a very serious love interest, and we've talked about that story before. She was shot to death on a walking path in D.C. So there's a big old long list here of all these other girlfriends, and it's just a partial list. It's called the harem. Mrs. Kennedy conceded to Dr. Frank Finnerty, to whom she confided the most intimate details of her marriage, that her husband was so promiscuous and his extramarital conquests so numerous there was no way either she or he could possibly identify them all. Her sensitivity about Marilyn was because she was the most popular female actress in the world, and a disclosure of the president's affair with Marilyn would cause the First Lady great embarrassment. Old Joe didn't like it, and he told Hoover, he didn't like this thing with Marilyn, and he told Hoover about it, especially because Marilyn had bucked the studio system, and Old Joe, you know, he had a studio. New York Times, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Arthur Kroc warned Joe to tell Jack to be careful after he was nominated. His indiscretions. Joe said the American people don't care how many times he gets laid. Joe sent his lawyer to spy on Marilyn. What was that report? We don't know. When Sinatra and Marilyn visited Hyannis, another guest was, okay, this I can never say this name right. I've never been able to say it. Porfirio Rubirosa. He was a political assassin and a suspect. The FBI suspected him. His wife was the daughter to Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, the dictator, and he's said to have killed people for Trujillo, who rewarded him with blank checks. They say that he was Ian Fleming's inspiration for James Bond. By day, Rubirosa was a man's man in what was still a macho world, an accomplished polo player, race car driver, adventurer, drinker, and bon vivant. By night, singer Eartha Kitt, one of his countless conquests, said he was Cary Grant, Errol Flynn, and Burt Lancaster rolled into one. Sounds exhausting. He courted Zsa Zsa Gabor, and 2 of his 5 wives were some of the richest women in the world, heiress Doris Duke and heiress Barbara Hutton, from whom he gained great wealth. He never did a proper day's work in his life, but his success with women enabled him to mix with royalty and film stars, own private planes, racing cars, and polo ponies. He even escorted Pat Kennedy Lawford on occasion, and yes, he also dated Marilyn Monroe back in 1948. What was a man like that doing hanging out with the President of the United States? The answer: he had known him since the latter's bachelor days, and hence was a house guest at the compound that weekend, despite allegedly being a cold-blooded assassin. Astonishing. Sinatra stayed an extra day. He and old Joe had business, including the Calneva Lodge. More about that later. Monroe was shocked how shabby and untended the house was. It was falling apart, didn't have repairs done, it needed to be painted. There's a story about the other son, the AG, being forced to apologize by his mother to a chauffeur's wife about yelling at her to get off the beach. So here's the story. She and, her husband's a chauffeur for Rose. And one day, the son and the mother were with the son and wife of the chauffeur were with the chauffeur. And he had to go on an errand. And they asked permission of Rose Kennedy, is it okay if we go down to the beach and just sit on the beach and hang out? And she said, of course, make yourself at home. So she takes her son and they put out beach towels and they get all comfortable. And the AG walks by and yells at them, get off of my property. This is private beach and I don't care who you are, you're not allowed to be on it. So his mother dragged him, the Attorney General, to this woman and forced him to apologize to her. And she said that he never looked her in the eye again, never spoke to her again, and had avoided the chauffeur of the family ever after that. There are rumors in the press about where Marilyn was, and a lot of nasty hints about what she was up to, probably indirectly coming from Joe Sr. 84 years later, she was exonerated. They compared her to Mata Hari, and 84 years later, Mata Hari was exonerated for what she had been accused of in World War I. She was an unwitting spy and a scapegoat, and she was exonerated in 2001. So they called Marilyn Monroe Mata Hari, and sounds like they're going to live to regret it, I guess. Dorothy Kilgallen got mail. Why does Jack entertain mobbed-up Sinatra while his Attorney General is investigating the mob? Good question. The answer was, don't worry about the president. He barely knows him. Sinatra. She had information passed on that Jack barely knew Sinatra. However, the campaign song for his presidential campaign was High Hopes, sung by Frank Sinatra. Kilgallen commented that Sinatra is the second biggest man in America today. He's rich and he's powerful. It's kind of hard to believe, but okay. In any case, next to the president, he's the biggest man in America. He's rich, powerful, adored by millions of fans. He's more famous than any writer, philosopher, clergyman, and poet. If you don't believe me, walk down your own street and ask the first 50 people you meet who's the author of the last Pulitzer Prize novel. Ask them who is Bertrand Russell. Ask them to name the present Archbishop of Canterbury. Ask them what Robert Frost does for a living. You'd be surprised at the blank looks. Ask them who Frank Sinatra is and you'll get 50 right answers. So why shouldn't the president entertain him if he wants to? The election is over. He won. So interestingly enough, around this time, Sinatra's newest movie was The Manchurian Candidate. There's something ironic going on here. I'm not quite sure what it is. Marilyn's new best friend, the AG, obviously they had met earlier. They knew each other, but she was focused on other siblings. A story was concocted to cover their rendezvous after a Lawford party. They said, "Oh, Marilyn is too drunk to drive. She had no car. Ralph had driven her to the party, so the AG got her home safely." That was the cover story. So any denial of these brothers' adventures with her, it's crock. There are suspicious gaps in the official Library of Congress, documents covering key periods in the work schedule of the AG. The records are incomplete. And the question is why. Numerous people were taken aback to encounter them as a couple at events, including dancing very close, according to somebody in San Francisco. Allegedly, now this book for me was kind of surprising. I didn't know a lot of this stuff about the younger brother. I was very disappointed, but there you go. No heroes. Allegedly, he had a Napoleon complex. This is characterized by domineering and aggressive behavior, by lying and narcissism, and it's compensatory because of being a short stature. The book cites articles about his growing sphere of influence and the increasing reach of control that he tried to take to usurp authority of department heads. It was a big power grab within the Department of Justice. McNamara objected, and so did others in the Department of Justice and the Department of State. The president got him to handle two matters that were outside the jurisdiction of the DOJ. He got him to handle the CIA and the new propaganda and psychological warfare program against opponents. Marilyn didn't realize the danger inherent in this flirtation. This was shaky soil. Chapter 25, Greenson tightens his grip. In the autumn of 61, Greenson actively was trying to isolate her from everyone that had been good for her. So when she wanted a dog, I'm sorry. I can't read my handwriting. I'm terrible. When she wanted to go with Joe to the opening of the World Series, the doctor told her not to go because they were about to have a breakthrough and she couldn't leave therapy. Next, he began to work on getting rid of Ralph. This is very sad. Marilyn had an angry phone call with her father's lawyer in Palm Springs. This is her real father. And he'd rejected her in the past, and she'd responded similarly when he called her. So when she called him in the past, he said, "Contact me through my lawyers." So now he's calling her, and she said to him, "Contact me through my lawyers." Click. So she was upset about that. Then she had to go back in the hospital with endometriosis. Ralph took her. She was there overnight. In the book, there's a whole stories about her loaning the car to Ralph and then asking him to let Joe Jr. use it. She was reading classic literature. She was a homebody. One night, her neighbors had a party, and the guests found out that she lived next door, and they spent the whole night ringing her doorbell and yelling, "Marilyn!" And she called Ralph to come over and disconnect it. He noticed she was taking a sleeping medication to sleep in the daytime because she wasn't getting sleep at night because of these noisy parties. He describes a particular day where he gave her a ride to the doctor, Greenson, and she was there all day. He sat in the car and he could hear yelling coming from the house. The two of them yelling at each other. This is her therapy. She began taking phone calls in the other room when Ralph was in the room, which was, they never had that problem before. He'd never done that before. The next day, she told him to go back to New York City. She said, "The doctor thinks I've grown too dependent on you." This is her best friend. And she said, the doctor has arranged a companion for me and he wants you to leave and go back to New York City. Ralph was shocked. He wrote a really nice letter to her. She gave him a check, like money was going to make a difference. Greenson told her that she had too many Ralphs in her life, because his first name was Ralph as well. Pat Newcomb said, I wish she had picked the right Ralph. Ralph, the good Ralph, was so upset that he left on the red eye that night. He just got on the first plane out of town. She was so over-medicated by her doctors that she just couldn't resist anything they told her to do. She did. Even the suggestion they had subjected her, there is even a suggestion they had subjected her to hypnotic suggestion while she was locked up at Payne Whitney. That doctor was a hypnotist, and there's some question about, did they medicate her so that she would submit to the hypnosis so that they could use the hypnosis to control her later? A lot of speculation. As they established more control and they interfered with her healthy lifestyle, she was too over-medicated to exercise, too over-medicated to eat well. She was just a mess again. And it wasn't her doing. It was because of these drugs. During this time, her contact with, family at Hyannisport, the brothers, it increased greatly. Once he got rid of Ralph Roberts, Greenson insisted that she have a housekeeper named Eunice Murray, who was 59 years old. She wasn't qualified. She wasn't into nursing. She didn't have psychiatric training. What she was a spy to help Greenson manipulate Marilyn day and night in her own home. She was born Eunice Gerant. She was a Swedenborgian. This is a belief system. It's a religious sect that believed Christ had revealed special messages through visions experienced over at least a 25-year period by scientist and Swedish Lutheran theologian Emanuel Swedenborg, 1688 to 1772. Swedenborg's mysticism captivated his followers as he claimed to have visited both heaven and hell. Eunice went to school but dropped out, and where am I here? At the age of 16 in 1918, she married, and she and her husband eventually had 3 daughters. She married John Murray. And by the end of World War II, they had settled into a house. Their son-in-law, Norman, became Marilyn's handyman. He claimed that Eunice's husband, John, was a devoted communist with a double life going on. While dating their daughter, the son-in-law claims, dating the Murray daughter, they had many meetings of the communist labor movement at their house, including Greenson coming. So there's this weird connection between Greenson and his communist activities, his knowledge of Eunice married to a very active communist, and then they plant her in Marilyn Monroe's house. Marilyn knew nothing about any of this. They believed that they were going to capture the cinema, capture the hearts and minds of the people. There you go. They wanted to infiltrate the film industry and get Marxism into scripts. Later release of the party archives in Moscow confirmed this is all true. I mean, there's documentation from the Kremlin that Hollywood was a target. Hoover was a communist obsessed, but some of it was actually true. Some of it was justified. For example, Frederick Vanderbilt Field was a benefactor of the Comintern, a very rich guy. He included him giving money to the Arts and Sciences and Professional Council that they ran in Los Angeles. This group was controlled by Greenson. Marilyn's other doctor, Engelberg, the weirdo with the pins and the baby, he was a part-time instructor for this group. Greenson helped to create the Hollywood Writers' Mobilization for the Defense on the UCLA campus. Greenson was on the faculty there. This is like a front. Eunice's husband, John, was smart, spoke 6 languages, gone most of the time to the East Coast or Mexico. He tried to communize Hollywood and the trade unions. For example, at the Conference of Studios in 1941, there was a union strike against Disney Studios. They targeted Warner Brothers next with 750 picketers blocking the employees from coming in. They broke up the melee with fire hoses and clubs. In 1945, the National Labor Relations Board rescinded a ruling that they had made, and they went against the communists. And lost. Communists lost. Murray abandoned Eunice and the children, and they separated. She had no say about her own house. When she and John split up, Dr. Greenson bought the house and controlled her living in the house. They divorced in 1950. And Greenson knew that Eunice depended on a job. She also depended on him for the house. And he was able to manipulate her and use her as a spy and a control element within his patients' lives, who were stars. He was clever at convincing patients they needed him 24/7 for psychiatric survival. He now lived in Eunice's former huge house, and it was really weird. He exerted emotional control over her. She faithfully followed his orders for the money. He sent her to take care of Marilyn, and Marilyn he treated like a surrogate daughter. He dominated her, and he dominated Eunice the way Murray had dominated Eunice. He got Eunice to introduce Marilyn to Frederick Vanderbilt Field, which would lead to her being exploited by the communists and put her under even more scrutiny of the government. So communists are spying on her, the mafia is spying on her, and now, Hoover, the FBI, are spying on her. She had no privacy. Documents now show that Eunice gave the FBI details. Now she's also talking to the FBI on Marilyn's activities when they questioned her. Friendships, her sex life, outrageous intrusion by the government. Many of her friends knew that Marilyn's friends knew that Eunice was not trustworthy. Whitey Snyder, he said, Eunice was not trusted. She reports every move to Greenson. She's quiet, secretive, hovering. Pat Newcomb was actually afraid of Eunice when you see her picture. Pat Newcomb was afraid of her. She keeps giving me that fishy stare, and I don't like it one bit. From day one, I did not trust Eunice Murray, who seemed to be snooping around. She was sort of a spook, always hovering, always on the fringes of things. She was eavesdropping on conversations, peering around corners, whispering on the phone, reporting to Greenson who Marilyn's guests were, what they said or did, how long they stayed, and other details. Typically, people who arrived at her house were given the third degree by Mrs. Murray, who asked who they were, why she had not seen them before, what business did they have being there, and if she wasn't satisfied with the answers, she angrily slammed the door in their faces. Whitey was very upset. He says, as the months went by, it was obvious Greenson's influence was becoming stronger and stronger. He felt the frequency of his interaction with Marilyn was unprofessional and greedy. Okay, read that. So, 1961, she did 2 photo shoots. The first was with Douglas Kirkland for Look magazine's 25th anniversary. He was impressed by her ease, her friendliness, her laughing, pleasant, playful attitude. He said she was kind of like a sister. He said she had a glow about her. Here was a superstar of the world, and I was a down-home boy. And she didn't look haggard. She didn't look drunk. She didn't look the worse for wear. She was beautiful, he said. On breaks in the shooting, she would be in costume, and he would have the camera set up, and they would lie on the floor just to take a rest and talk to each other. Marilyn talked about herself, and when she talked with him about the pictures he took off of her and was analyzing the pictures, she always referred to herself in the pictures as that girl. She cut up 60 she didn't like. The second photographer was Eric Skipsey, a publicist. He wait a minute. Eric Skipsky was the photographer, and the publicist was 45 minutes late. So Eric, the photographer, and Marilyn talked and joked and drank champagne. And when Pat, the publicist, arrived, she said kind of dismissively to the photographer, "You have 10 more minutes." And Marilyn said, "Hey, take as long as you want. They're my pics, not hers." She was very nice and very considerate, he later said, not at all like a superstar. She was very busy going over the designs to redo her apartment in New York that she wanted to buy. She was serious about moving at the end of '61, but she had a trauma, and this trauma got her to leave New York. According to Haspel, this is the real reason about what happened. While she was rehearsing lines with a female actor for the actor's studio in a restaurant booth, they were trading lines. The woman kissed her just out of the blue. And, this is in public, and this is, olden days. She jumped out of the booth and fled. She was very upset. She'd been set up. There were 2 reporters right across from the booth, intentionally placed there to be witnesses. And she felt she couldn't trust anyone from the actor's studio. Like, why did they do that? What were they trying to do to her? Who would try to do that to her? She didn't trust anybody. It really created a great trauma in her ability to trust other people. She couldn't understand why a friend would do that. She thought this actress was a friend. This became her ultimate reason for moving out of New York. Larry Jordan, the writer of this book, found out that the actor who kissed her was Madeline Sherwood, who became a Broadway star. She was in the TV show, The Flying Nun. She later started a support group later in life for survivors of childhood incest. That's interesting. November of '61, Jack was in Hollywood. Wonder who he was meeting. The next day, he was at Lawford's beach house, and so was Marilyn. Witnesses said that Jack left, and he had no time for anything with Marilyn. But he spent 6 hours at the hotel. He left the party early, but he then went back to the hotel, and he spent 6 hours at his hotel before he had to leave for D.C. And he was so exhausted on the plane, he had to sleep on the plane back. They left L.A. so late. There's documentation that Greenson was very involved in Fox's effort to get Marilyn to film Something's Gotta Give. She didn't like the script. There are transcripts between the doctor and the studio's attorneys from late at night, and also with a story editor. He manipulated firing several professionals involved in the production, and George Cukor, the director, found out, and he got really mad about this. These changes were sanctioned by 3 Fox executives who were cronies of the family in Hyannis. They knew nothing about films, but they were more like corporate raiders. It was like they were there to destroy the studio. Their investment firms bought majority stock in Fox, and they ran up huge studio debt. Someone was profiting from this intentional plunder and coincidentally intentionally harming Monroe's career. What was that all about? Greenson got Marilyn to dump MCA as her representation and hire his brother-in-law, Mickey Rudin, who was Sinatra's attorney. I mean, it's hard to keep track of all these connections. It's ridiculous. Curiously, Sinatra's butler, George Jacobs, described Mr. Rudin as a combination bagman, hitman, and Hollywood hustler. What does hitman mean in the context of Marilyn Monroe? Marilyn's half-sister Bernice found Mickey Rudin to be cold and aloof when she subsequently met him. That question, what does a hitman mean in the context of Monroe? Keep that in the back of your mind. Rudin, Sinatra's attorney, always defended Sinatra in the media. His bad behavior, his rudeness, and his nastiness. He's known to be a proactive advocate for his clients. For example, he represented Lucille Ball, and she got the most lucrative CBS contract and more independence and control that most women in Hollywood ever had. He saw that Marilyn was reckless with money. She was generous to people to her own detriment, and often didn't have cash and had to take out loans against money owed to her by the studios. He arranged for the gifts that she gave to be taxed by the recipients. She gave someone a fur coat, and like Paula Strasberg got stuff, other people got stuff, and then this guy, Rudin, shows up and says, well, actually, those need to be taxed because they're partial payment, they're not gifts. Marilyn was described by Thanksgiving Day guests she went to this party as not stuck up, just folks. She died after she died. Greenson misled other people about her that November, but there were enough witnesses who really knew how she was and saw her in action. He claimed that she went through a severe depression and paranoid reaction precipitated by her disappointment in Greenson, when he became impatient with her constant complaints about this and that, about people who were taking advantage of her. She talked about retiring from the movie industry to herself. I had to place nurses in her apartment night and day to keep strict control over medication since I felt she was potentially harmful. Marilyn fought with these nurses so that after a few weeks it was impossible to keep any of them. I was forced to get an elderly housekeeper, Eunice, to look after Marilyn at night and stay in the house with her. However, there's no documentation of all these nurses. This was all made up. It wasn't true, and she wasn't in terrible shape. He frequently told people she was mentally ill. But she was very socially active and had many friends, and they all described her as well. What was he up to? What was he doing? How could she be regularly socializing with the President of the United States, actors and actresses who were so famous? Proof of her with Jack, the younger brother, and all comes from the daughter of an investment banker. The younger brother was not a Puritan. He's often called that, but he wasn't. The Lawfords helped to facilitate these assignations. She would go in disguise as Lawford's dowdy secretary. At a New York December 61st party, when she entered, this is a quote, "It was like the parting of the Red Sea." This is Arlene Dahl. "Everything and everyone stopped. Jack told her, 'Finally, you're here.' And he left shortly. So did Marilyn. There are those who deny or minimize the relationship between all this family member individuals and her, but there are loads of witnesses, like Arlene Dahl. She had no reason to lie. Denial of reality is not an attractive trait for any biographer. It's an old saying. Whoever told the Attorney General that the FBI surveillance was being put on Giancana, and they hoped to be able to get Sinatra to get to Jack Kennedy. Sinatra and Old Joe were pals, and they were working on him influencing the president through his father. But then Old Joe had a stroke. And there's a description of how when he had his stroke, nobody got him treatment. He had the stroke and they put him to bed in the house and went about their business. No one called in a doctor for like most of the day. It's really awful. And by the time they did, damage had happened and he was in a wheelchair the rest of his life. He'd always been the family member to deal with Bob. Now there was a problem. There was unresolved business. So late in December of 61, Marilyn wrote a detailed letter to the Strasbergs to convince them to move to Hollywood. She mentioned working with attorneys on an independent production unit and had an important position to give Lee Strasberg in L.A. Pull out my paper here. She told them that Brando was interested. Many resented Strasberg's exploitation of her, and they saw her, these people who were using her saw her as just a big opportunity. Brando thought so too. Let me see here. This is what Brando had to say. He reflected the acting coach was an ambitious, selfish man who exploited the people who attended the actor's studio, and he tried to project himself as an acting oracle and guru. Some people worshipped him, but I never knew why. Marilyn gave $12,000 to the actor's studio to keep it afloat, and then she flew to New York to visit them. They exploited her trust. Early in 1966, the Los Angeles branch of the actor's studio began. She had tried so hard to get that started. And then in 1969, Lee Strasberg started his Theater Institute with the Young People's Program. As Marilyn increased her association with the family, alarm bells were going on in Washington, D.C. Lawford was considered an asset for the mob through Sinatra, and they brazenly associated in public. He made no bones about it. He hung around with mobsters. So he was wiretapped, his beach house, his Santa Monica house. Marilyn called Ralph in New York and told him that her therapy was miserable. So these things are all going on simultaneously. She missed him and asked him to visit. She needed a big break from the doctor, but Greenson told Murray, Eunice, to find a house for Marilyn to buy, trying to distract her and keep her away from everybody. Joe DiMaggio showed up for Christmas, which he had done before, and he walked in and took an instant dislike to Eunice. Joe was there maybe 30 minutes when he figured out that things had gotten much worse for Marilyn. Let me put it to you this way. He took one look at that Mrs. Murray and knew she was trouble. From what he told me, he said, I don't want you, he said this to Eunice, I don't want you knowing anything about me or my business. You work for Marilyn, but you're not her friend, and you're not my friend. If it were up to me, you wouldn't even exist. He was very direct with her. I'm sure she had a lot to tell Greenson about him. Well, it was all recorded, wasn't it? Because she was wiretapped. But Marilyn seemed well. She talked Joe into staying for Christmas Day and going with her to Greenson's house. Joe was very disturbed by Marilyn's relationship with that whole family, and he didn't really know the half of it. Marilyn and Joe were described as being like an old married couple at this party. So that's the end of that video. The end of this video, video 8, and we will be back, and I will tantalize you with the promise of probably a couple of extra videos as we approach Christmas, because otherwise we're going to be working on this till Easter. So not that it's hard work, but it's a long book, and so, you know, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and the plot thickens. Slung foil.